Good day, History 365. Today we're going to be talking about Anglo-Saxon England and the conquest of Anglo-Saxon England by William the Duke of Normandy in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. Now, the Roman Empire famously falls first in Britain. In 409 AD, supposedly the Emperor Honorius sends a letter to the inhabitants of the Roman province of Britain and basically says the Roman army has left and it's not coming back. And from this point onward, the inhabitants of Britain are on their own. Now, it seems that the situation basically deteriorates into anarchy as the inhabitants of Britain both fight amongst themselves and also suffer severely from freebooting raids by Scottish and Irish raiders. Indeed, it seems the term Scots means something like freebooter. One of the victims of these raids is a young Roman named Patricius, who is taken to Ireland as a slave. He's a Roman Christian. He eventually escapes, but then returns to Ireland to seek to both convert the island and also provide pastoral services to Roman Christian slaves who are already in Ireland. And he becomes St. Patrick. So the military situation in Britain is therefore very bad if we go way back to the 5th century AD. And one solution that people in Britain have is to invite various barbarian chieftains to immigrate into what had been the province of Britain. Some of these are Angles, some of these are Saxons, some of these are Jutes, and these chieftains essentially set up small kind of petty kingdoms that over time to kind of produce an ethnogenesis that gives us Anglo-Saxon, the foundation of the English language from essentially this churn of different Germanic dialects from these Germanic invaders. And eventually a series of petty, somewhat larger but still quite small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. By the 9th century, there are sort of 7 big kingdoms, sometimes referred to by early modern historians as the 7 kingdoms of England, and a number of actually smaller kingdoms as well. These are finally united by the King of Wessex, Alfred the Great, into a larger kingdom, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which will persist from the 9th century up until 1066. Now, this is a kingdom that suffers significantly from Viking raids when the Vikings begin to hit in the late 8th century AD. Now, we saw when we looked at France that one, it seems, kind of solution to Viking raids is actually to create this decentralized feudal system. To grant land to important nobles on the condition that they and their followers provide you with military service. Now, this may also help with Vikings because in granting land and saying, hey, look, you're the Duke of Normandy or Burgundy or wherever, you're basically saying, hey, when the Vikings hit your fief, or even the fiefs of your followers, they will have you'll have reason to actually organize the defense of that area. I, as the King of France, don't have to worry about it. All I have to do is say, oh gosh, the Vikings are raiding there, and my guess is you'll have big motive to organize a defense so that they don't ravage your territories and your villages and whatnot. So in France, we see this sort of movement towards a kind of decentralized military response in the feudal system. In England, in Anglo-Saxon England, we see actually the opposite, a move to a more centralized administrative system. Indeed, Anglo-Saxon England is probably one of the most centralized states in the early medieval period. The way that centralization works is by breaking up the kingdom into smaller administrative units. So dividing the kingdom up into shires, and each shire has a administrative assistant that is appointed by the king called a reeve. And each shire is in turn divided into hundreds, and a hundred. The name actually may be quite old. It doesn't involve 100 people or 100 villages. It's just a subdivision of the shire. So you have each hundred also has a reeve. So you have 100 reeve and a shire reeve. And of course, the term shire reeve is where we get our modern term sheriff, somebody who has a local administrative duty for maintaining law and order. So shire reeves and 100 reeves do have functions that we might associate with sheriffs, hunting down brigands, enforcing laws, but they also help to organize defense. So if the Vikings hit a particular shire, the shire reeve would be a royal official who might undertake organizing the local defense of this area. But again, the difference with feudalism is the reeves are direct appointees of the king. The administrative breakdown is simply a way to allow the king to manage his territory overall. Now, in addition to appointing 100 reeves and shire reeves, the Anglo-Saxon kings also set up a system of fortifications. And these fortifications are called burhs, related to the kind of, if you hear towns that are named Waterbury or Woodbury, that bury or burg is the same basic root. It sort of is Germanic for a fortified place. And so the Anglo-Saxon kings set up a series of fortified places. In some instances, you can actually still see the earthen or occasionally stone ramparts of these burhs still standing. And this is another attempt, through again a kind of centralized process, to harden Anglo-Saxon territory against the possibility of raiders coming in from the coast or working their way up the river system. Now, you might say in the long run this fails, because in 1014 a Scandinavian warlord named Newt manages to become not only the king of England, but eventually the king of a kind of big Scandinavian empire that includes England and Denmark and part of Norway. This is Newt the Great. And this actually will have the dynastic consequence of entangling English lines of succession with a whole sort of host of Scandinavian princes. Now, upon Knut's death, the throne of England goes back to the Anglo-Saxon line. And of course, this reversion is made easier by the fact that Knut had married the Anglo-Saxon queen. In fact, he'd taken the wife of the Anglo-Saxon king he'd overthrown. And so, therefore, in some ways, the line of succession doesn't feel all that interrupted. It's not just the Wessex line, but it's also actually the son of Knut's queen consort. This is Edward the Confessor. Now, Edward the Confessor in English tradition is remembered as a very good and pious king, but there's one problem in terms of maintaining dynastic succession. Edward the Confessor is too pious. He doesn't want to have sex, and because he devotes himself to chastity, it seems as a form of Christian devotion, he has no children. And therefore, when he dies in 1065, there is no immediate line to succeed him. And so therefore, all of the potential claimants are going to be kind of from these ancillary lines, both in England and also kind of across the Scandinavian diaspora. Now, the succession is immediate, at least for one claimant, relatively smooth. And it goes to Herald Goodwin, who is basically a prince in the Wessex lineage. It seems that he may have basically been appointed by Edward prior to his death. And importantly, Anglo-Saxon kings don't just rule by divine right. They need to have their kingship ratified by an institution called the Witan. which is essentially a council of elders that elects or acclaims the new king, and Herald Goodwin gets this acclamation. So upon Edward the Confessor's death, Herald starts to rule effectively as the next Anglo-Saxon king. Now that said, because Newt the Great had been simultaneously king of Denmark and had been intermarried into all of these lines of Scandinavian nobility, there are two Vikings who think they too should be king of England. One is the king of Norway, also confusingly named Harold, oftentimes referred to as Herald Hardrada, to differentiate him from Herald Goodwin, who is now ruling as King of England. But Herald Hardrada thinks that he too, again because of some of these sort of ancillary lineages, should be ruling as King of England and readies an invasion force to enforce his claim. He's not the only one. The other key figure is going to be the Duke of Normandy, William. Now, William, simply to be Duke of Normandy, has had quite an adventurous life up till now. He was initially born illegitimate. He was born a bastard. Nonetheless, and this is a period when significant parts of France are racked by warfare and instability, and warfare in between these feudal lords of the king. We have a period of weak kings in France, and so these big dukes frequently are engaging in all kinds of combat and intrigues. And for a while, young William is sort of just a pawn of these intrigues, but grows up to be quite a ferocious man, secures and consolidates his power within Normandy, and then looks to England. Now, William's claim, frankly, isn't all that good. He actually has to kind of invent a claim, and that is that he says, before Edward the Confessor died, Herald Goodwin was shipwrecked, and I took him in. I was shipwrecked off the coast of France, and I took him in. I gave him aid, I gave him a new suit of armor, and as he was very grateful for this, he told me that, oh, by the way, I have no claim on the throne of England, and Harold then, supposedly, this is William's telling, Harold then swore on sacred relics, the relics of saints, renouncing any claim to be king of England. And here we actually see William quite cleverly using religion, using the importance of saintly relics in Christian devotion to strengthen what is probably a pretty weak sauce claim on the English throne. He also, again, is a very ancillary claim in terms of genealogy. And of course, unlike Harold, he hasn't been elected by the Witan, elected by this sort of group of Anglo-Saxon senior nobility. The closest thing to what will eventually become, say, the English Parliament, although the Parliament is very much an institution of the Norman kings. So Harold, therefore, has this problem that he has not one but two big, powerful warlords who are interested in challenging him for his throne. Much to his disadvantage, they both invaded basically the same time. Now, Herald Hardrada gets there first, and Hardrada is actually aided by none other than Herald Goodwin's brother, Tustig, who is basically peeved that Goodwinson had not supported his claim to be Earl of Northumbria when Edward the Confessor was still living, so there's a kind of petty personal feud between them, and Tostig's solution is say, well, I'm going to support somebody else beyond my own brother to be the king of England. But this means that Herald Hardrada actually has a kind of inside man who knows the lay of the land, has some connections, and it's the Norwegian Viking invasion that gets there first, and it lands in the north of England near York. Again, this is a territory that is kind of Tostig's home territory, and indeed he hopes that he's going to be able to simply arrange the surrender of various territories. Now, what Herald Hardrada doesn't quite anticipate is how effectively Herald Goodwin mobilizes against this invasion. Now, remember, there is no feudalism yet in Anglo-Saxon England. The main way in which armies are raised is essentially a militia. And this militia is called a fyrd, which essentially requires both able-bodied commoners as well as able-bodied nobles to be willing to serve when service is demanded from them. And then again, they could be called up by a sheriff to repel a Viking incursion. Indeed, it seems that Anglo-Saxon laws say that if there is an army of more than 35 men, 35 men isn't a very big army, but that's a decent-sized Viking raiding party, then all able-bodied men have to be willing to mobilize to repel that raid. So Herald Goodwin, as this much bigger army, probably several thousand soldiers, lands in northern England. He calls up the Anglo-Saxon militia. Now, in addition to the Anglo-Saxon militia, in addition to the fyrd, he also has his own retainers, the men who are the kind of full-time soldiers attached to his royal household, and these are called the housecarls. Now, the institution of housecarls is actually a Danish institution, imported when Newt the Great is the king of England after 1014, and then the institution remains after his death even as the Anglo-Saxon line reemerges. So Herald Goodwin therefore has kind of two elements in his army: the small number of retainers, who are essentially professional soldiers who are maintained probably somewhat full-time as the armed members of the king's household, the housecarls, and these probably have better armament, better equipment, are better trained. It seems that one way you can distinguish a housecarl is many of them carry great axes, long poled axes, big war axes, which probably aren't just used for making big chops, but may also actually be used essentially as pole arms, as kind of spears that you can both thrust with and also use to try to say hook a rider and pull him off a horse if you're fighting against a cavalryman. So we have these housecarls who again probably are quite heavily armed, and many of them carry these big, great axes. And then other members of the Anglo-Saxon fyrd, whose armament may vary. Some of the nobility may be, nobles or wealthier men may be quite well armed. Other footmen may simply come as they are. Now, this army encounters the army of Herald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge and wins a crushing success. It seems the fighting is fierce. The sort of key moment, though, is quite simply when Herald Hardrada takes an arrow in the throat and dies. And with the death of the claimant to the English throne, the army doesn't have much reason to really hold out other than to simply try to escape with their lives. So Herald Goodwin has won the first big battle. Now he has to turn and rapidly march south to confront the second invasion, which has landed near Hastings, and that is of William of Normandy. Now, one thing that military historians debate is, did the exhaustion of fighting two battles in quick succession, separated only by a forced march, disadvantage the Anglo-Saxons? The answer is most likely, well, yes, somewhat. That Goodwinson's army was tired, although it should be noted that, as far as we can tell, the Battle of Hastings lasts 9 hours, which means that the army that reaches Hastings probably is tired, but it isn't so exhausted that it can't fight a 9-hour-long battle when the hostilities break out. Now, we don't have a great sense, again, as so often the reports of size vary. William the Conqueror's army is probably not all that big. It maybe at most is 10,000 men, of which maybe 2,000 or 3,000 are cavalry. The rest infantry, including, it seems, a significant number of archers. The Anglo-Saxon army, at least judging from the Bayeux Tapestry, seems to be predominantly infantry, and that includes even the elite soldiers in the Anglo-Saxon army, including the men who seem to be housecarls armed with these great axes, all fight on foot. And this may be one advantage of the feudal system, is because the way that it allots these fiefs, the fact that the fief for knight service is still quite large, is it puts a premium on cavalry service. Whereas if you're calling up the militia, you're likely to get mostly infantry. Now, the good news for this tired, if not necessarily completely exhausted army, the Anglo-Saxon army, is all they have to do is stop the Normans. And therefore, most of the battle involves the Anglo-Saxons taking up a defensive position on some heights and essentially enduring the Norman charges. And for 9 hours, they do this quite well. They form a shield wall. We've been talking about shield walls since we looked at the Sumerian phalanxes and the Greek phalanxes. And guess what? They still got shields, and that's the logical thing to do if you've got a bunch of guys with shields and they're under attack. Lock shields and form a barrier. The shield wall seems to successfully repel the Norman archers and also frustrates attempts by the Norman knights to charge them. And so this is a very effective strategy. Early in the battle on William's side, there is a crisis because there is a rumor that William himself has been killed, and this seems to lead to a kind of panic in his army. With good reason, and it seems that indeed the Bayeux Tapestry, one of the most interesting sources for this battle, shows William basically showing his face to his army, proving to his followers that he is still very much alive, and that there is still, in fact, a cause to fight for. Some chroniclers suggest that as a tactic, the Norman army tries to launch some feint retreats, in the hope that some of the Anglo-Saxons will foolishly pursue down the hill and then the Normans can turn and slaughter them. That may or may not work, although it doesn't seem that breaks the English position. Ultimately, as far as we can tell, what breaks the English position is the freak event of Herald Goodwin himself is killed. It's debated how he's killed. Frustratingly for us on the Bayeux Tapestry, where it says Harold the King is dead, inter factus est, there's two men who might be Harold, although one of them quite prominently has an arrow through his eye. And there are some chroniclers who suggest that Harold takes an arrow through his eye. Maybe they're following this scene on the Bayeux Tapestry. But that might explain where the shield wall is holding. The shield wall is holding. It's mostly repelling the archers, but Harold is walking along his line or riding along his line, and an arrow gets over the shield wall, goes through Harold's face, he's dead, and that seems to devolve into a panic. The Anglo-Saxon army collapses, and of course the Anglo-Saxon army may already be under significant physical and psychological stress because of the exhaustion of fighting a battle up north and then marching back south, but it finally collapses at the end of the day, and at this point, while there are a few more attempts at resistance to the Normans, the defeat of the Anglo-Saxon militia, and also the fact that the death of the king wipes out the sort of most obvious rallying point, William the Conqueror is able to quite quickly mop up English forces, to have himself crowned King of England, and to stamp out further resistance shortly afterwards. Now, this isn't a course on English constitutional history, but this is a big event from the point of view of English constitutional history. A whole set of Anglo-Saxon institutions are swept away. Norman feudalism is imposed in England because William wants to reward the barons and knights who have served with him. And it's actually imposed more completely than it will be everywhere else, because now William can really claim to own all of England. And as someone who owns all of England by the right of conquest, he can parcel all of it out to his followers. So this will actually give England one of the most complete and intensive set of feudal institutions, much more intensive even than in France, where these institutions develop. So certainly a real case where the battle has consequences beyond just shifting who's going to be the king of England. All right, so that's 1066 and all that jazz. Next time, we will be taking a look at one of the most important bits of forensic evidence we have for medieval warfare, and that is the skeletal evidence from the Battle of Wisby. I'll see you Wednesday.